Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into what I think is a completely bizarre historical mystery. We're going to figure out why a heavily armed Roman legionary, a guy stepping onto a brutal ancient battlefield, would intentionally leave one of his legs completely exposed. When we picture the ancient Roman military machine, we usually imagine this terrifying wall of perfectly matched, heavily plated super soldiers. But history, as it always does, hides its absolute best stories in the asymmetrical, slightly weird details. We're going to explore how the famous Roman manupular system didn't just revolutionize their battlefield tactics, it actually created a huge domino effect that totally dictated the personal equipment choices of the soldiers themselves. Right, so let's jump into this puzzle. It's a pretty striking image to imagine, isn't it? Picture this soldier covered in heavy bronze and iron, holding a massive shield, wielding a deadly sword, but he's only got one armored shin guard, which is called a greave, strapped to his leg. Why on earth would you do that? Well, to understand ancient military fashion, we actually have to rewind the clock a bit to a massive tactical disaster, one that basically forced Rome to completely reevaluate how it fought. You see, early Romans didn't actually have their own unique fighting style right out of the gate. They basically copy-pasted the Greek hoplite style of warfare. This meant weighing their warriors down in full, heavy armor, which absolutely included perfectly matched shin guards for both legs. Now, the Greeks fought in tight, strategically located valleys and natural choke points. Because of that really specific, mountainous topography, their form of warfare highly rewarded endurance and staying power over agility. Wearing a few extra pounds of heavy bronze on your legs? Totally fine when your only job is just to hold a solid line in a narrow mountain pass. But then came the harsh wake-up call. During the Samnite Wars in the middle of the 4th century BC, Rome realized this wasn't working. The heavy, rigid Greek phalanx, which was essentially just a giant, unstoppable rectangle of thousands of men, suffered absolutely crushing defeats in Italy's rough, uneven hill country. That rigid wall of spears simply couldn't hold its shape when the ground got bumpy. It was a disaster. And this forced Rome to radically rethink their strategy and abandon that Greek style for something completely new. So they pivot. Rome completely throws out that giant rectangle formation and invents the manupular system. Instead of thousands of men locked tightly together, they broke the army down into these smaller units called maniples, which literally translates to handfuls. These were highly mobile units consisting of just 60 to 120 men, and this was a total game changer. It allowed the Roman army to bend, flex, and flow over rough terrain without shattering their formation. This birthed a brilliantly organized three-line checkerboard pattern. Up in the front, you had the velites. These were the youngest skirmishers who prioritized speed, so they wore almost no armor. Behind them were the hastati and principes, the mature fighters right in the prime of their lives who formed the main battle lines. And then, waiting in the rear, you had the triarii, the old grizzled veterans. The absolute genius of this manupular system was that when the front lines became exhausted or took heavy hits, they could neatly withdraw through the gaps to the rear. Then, fresh, fully rested soldiers would step up to seamlessly continue the fight. But here's the thing about military history. A change in tactics always demands a change in tools. For the main fighters, that old-school thrusting spear was tossed right out and replaced by a heavy javelin called a pilum. The new tactic was to hurl these massive heavy javelins at the enemy right before charging in with short, thrusting swords. Because of this massive shift in how they engaged, the traditional round shield they'd been using had to be completely discarded as well. That old round shield was replaced by something significantly larger and far more protective. We are talking about the scutum. This was a massive, semi-cylindrical oval shield. It's basically a walking wall. And interestingly enough, the Romans didn't even invent this design out of thin air. It was actually heavily inspired by Celtic shield designs. This massive piece of wood, leather, and iron would go on to become the iconic defensive barrier of the Roman legionary. And this brings us right back to our core mystery, this broader tactical shift, specifically adopting that massive scutum shield because of the new manupular tactics, directly caused a radical asymmetrical change in their leg armor. Right after this military reorganization, it suddenly became incredibly common for Roman legionaries to ditch their right shin guard entirely, choosing to wear only one greave specifically on the left leg. Now, what's so fascinating here is how this whole tactical domino effect triggered 4 incredibly human, relatable reasons for dropping that right greave. It wasn't just some general waking up one day and issuing a weird mandate. It was a perfect storm of safety, economics, physical exhaustion, and, surprisingly, military fashion. Let's break each of these down to see how a soldier's daily reality on the ground totally shaped their armor. First up, and definitely the most important, was pure practical safety. Because that new Shut'em shield was so much larger and longer than the old round shields, the soldiers' fighting stance had to physically change. They adopted a slightly wider stance, pushing their left side forward to brace behind that massive shield. In this new position, the soldier's back right leg was naturally tucked away and shielded from enemy weapons. It was literally just out of the primary danger zone. So keeping heavy armor on a leg that wasn't going to get hit? Kind of redundant. Beyond safety, we have to look at the harsh reality of the soldier's wallet. In this era of the Republic, Roman citizens were required to pay for and provide their own equipment, and war is expensive. By ditching the suddenly unnecessary bronze greave on the right leg, a younger or maybe less wealthy soldier freed up a good chunk of cash. They could redirect those funds to upgrade truly crucial items, like a stronger helmet, higher quality chest armor, or an even sturdier shield. It was a deadly serious form of budget management. Then, of course, there was the sheer physical toll, which really just comes down to a simple, heavy number: 3. Most bronze greaves weighed around 2 or 3 pounds. Now, look, 3 pounds might not sound like much when you were just standing there, but remember, the Roman Empire was expanding rapidly. The distances marched and the heavy packs carried were becoming agonizingly long. Shedding just 2 or 3 pounds of dead weight from your leg makes an immense difference in fighting off fatigue when you're hiking hundreds of miles. These guys became ruthlessly economical with the weight they carried. But perhaps the most relatable reason of all, honestly, was herd mentality and fashion. What undoubtedly started out as a practical, safety, and economic choice eventually transitioned into a full-blown cultural trend. Humans naturally just want to fit in, right? As more and more seasoned soldiers opted for that single greave look, it became the standard visual of a tough veteran legionary. Over time, wearing 2 greaves wasn't just seen as a waste of money, it was deemed totally unnecessary. And frankly, it just marked you as an uncool rookie. Okay, let's fast forward a few centuries and see how this builds when the Roman army transforms once again. The old levied citizen legions of the past were eventually replaced by a professional, full-time standing force. Under this new imperial system, equipment actually became standardized, and more importantly, it was subsidized by the state. Soldiers were no longer forced to foot the bill for their basic kit out of their own pockets. So with the state paying, did the right greave come back? Actually, no. Under this new state system, a stark contrast emerged. For the standard enlisted legionary, greaves vanished entirely as a required piece of state-issued equipment. While they could technically go out and buy them with their own money, the archaeological record shows they almost never did. Meanwhile, the officers, like the centurions, maintained them as a standard part of their kit, probably as a mark of status or just because they could afford the extra luxury to look important. Now, just because the state provided the basics didn't mean these soldiers stopped customizing their gear. While regular legionaries rarely bought leg armor anymore, they happily spent their own wages on specialized non-standard gear. A super popular choice was the pugio, which is a stocky utility dagger and a backup weapon of last resort. Another really fascinating addition was the monica. This was a segmented forearm guard specifically meant to protect the soldier's right arm. Think about it. As they thrust their sword past the protective edge of that huge scutum shield, that arm was vulnerable. So they were still protecting their exposed right side, they just shifted focus from the leg up to the arm. But military evolution is almost always circular. When the Roman army reorganized yet again later on in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, their tactics kind of shifted backwards in time. They brought back the round shields and thrusting spears, and, right on cue, as the large scutum disappeared and their fighting stance changed back to a more forward-facing posture, guess what? The greaves suddenly made a massive comeback to protect those newly exposed shin. Actually, there's a really fascinating footnote to this whole comeback story, and it's about how historians track these changes. Later in Roman history, iron greaves became much more affordable than bronze ones. But there's a huge catch here. Iron rusts and corrodes way more easily compared to bronze. Because of this, very few iron greaves have actually survived in the archaeological record. They've simply rusted away into the earth over the millennia. And that sparks some incredibly lively scholarly debates today about exactly how common they truly were in those later centuries. So as we wrap up this explainer on how shifting terrain and the manipular system completely rewrote the equipment loadout of the Roman legionary, I want to leave you with something to chew on. We've seen how a simple 3-pound piece of bronze was dropped for a mix of tactical survival, strict budgeting, and eventually just plain old fashion. So ask yourself, when you look at the highly specialized gear people wear today, whether we're talking about modern soldiers, professional athletes, or honestly, just people walking down the street, where does the pure practical utility end and the cultural fashion actually begin? Thanks for joining me to explore this brilliant piece of history. Keep questioning what you see, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.